Good evening. I'd like to call this workshop meeting to order. If you will rise with me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Posey, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, Madam Supervisor. Trustee Bussino, Trustee Nevers, Trustee Smith. Present. Trustee Krasinski.
Here.
Treasurer Goodhue. Here. Clerk Posey here, and Supervisor Dunn.
Here. We have had contact with Ms. Nevers. She's on her way, so I'm sure she's caught in traffic somewhere. However, we'll move on with the approval of the agenda items with any corrections, deletions, or additions.
Seeing none, I'll make a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Support.
Motion by Ms. Posey, seconded by Mr. Krasinski, to approve the agenda as presented. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed by saying nay. That motion carries. Next, we have the approval of the previous workshop meeting minutes, and those were from October the 3rd of 2018. Any deletions or corrections to the minutes?
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes as presented.
Motion by Ms. Goodhue,
Support.
supported by Ms. Smith, to approve the previous workshop meeting minutes. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed by saying nay.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think, one, is I don't think Ms. Smith can second that motion because she wasn't on the board yet. So, and the only thing, yeah, so it has to
She
be.
can if she reviewed the minutes.
Yes.
Okay, she can if she, okay,
Yep.
all right.
Okay.
Want to make sure,
That's right. Thank you.
checking on you.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to public comments, and this is on agenda items only. If you want to make a comment, please go to the podium, state your name for the record, and remember there's a 3-minute time limit. Nobody, okay? Number 5 is a review of the proposed ethics ordinance submitted by the Ethics Advisory Committee. There's Ms. Nevers now.
Karen's trying to
Madam
get-
Chair? Yes. Can I speak to this?
Certainly,
As of now?
please do.
Okay. I just want to, I think that we can all agree that assuring ethical behavior is important to all of us. When an ordinance is created, it must be based on facts and the law and not on emotions or opinions. I want to make sure that we're on the right track and have not gotten off of track. I have a timeline of our process. I know Mr. Gellios put a timeline of their meetings when they met, so I have a timeline of the actual process. On December the 6th, 2017, this was brought to the board by Mr. Bussino. On January 16, 2018, a motion was made to approve the application form, qualifications to apply for committee, and the deadline. February 20th, 2018, the deadline for applying to the committee was that date. 2/28/18, the advisory committee information was created and the committee appointed. 4/30/2018, the board approved the general advisory committee guidelines. On 10/3/2018, a draft of the ordinance was submitted at a workshop. On 4/15/2019, we received a revised ordinance by email. And then that brings us to this evening. But going back to the meeting on December the 6th, 2017, this motion was approved. Motion to approve the request to solicit a team that will research, develop, and report to the Township Board a possible ethics ordinance that may include the creation of a civil-led ethics board that will help the township board investigate and enforce township policy violations. With the guidelines passed on 4/30 of 18, it was stated the purpose of the Ethics Advisory Committee is that the committee will research, develop, and report to the Township Board a possible ethics ordinance or other means to address ethical behavior. So before we get too far, I would like the committee to please address what research was done in accordance with the above and what were the results of that research.
Thank you. Anyone
Are you
like to
talking
s-
back about October, when we first brought this up? Is that what you're
Excuse me.
referring to?
Yes, we want to know what you did from get-go. when
Oh,
you
from
s-
day one?
From day one.
Okay,
What
gotcha.
kind of research you did?
Well, we looked at several ordinances. We looked at different reference material from MML, MTA. As you know, we took the county ethics ordinance as a base. And then we did what I thought was improve it, make it more readable, easier to understand, clarify, and then from there, and then we just, as we looked through all the other materials, different ordinances, even Chicago and Huron, Birmingham, all that. Anyway, and then plus what we got from MML and MTA, well, then we ended up with the final document that we presented. And when we presented it in October, we said that it was a living document, it wasn't etched in stone, and it needed to be reviewed. Actually, when the committee had every understanding that, I had that in my opening statement, but we knew when we submitted it that, we didn't try to solicit funds to have a different legal attorney look at it and review it, because ultimately we knew Mr. Sorty was going to do that on behalf of the township. So, figured that would be the jumping point when we had the first workshop as far as, okay, what some of your concerns were. I got some things I think to address some of your concerns, but there's still some things I had concerns about when I had a conversation with Mr. Sorty, just on the, I'm finding the word confidential used a lot in as it pertains to either somebody coming in making a complaint, be it an employee or whatever. What rights are there? I mean, under FOIA, even they have something about the right to privacy. I don't understand the full definition of what does that mean. So those are some of the questions I had back in the fall. But at any rate, and I was hoping, frankly, that my first suggestion for this meeting was the committee to meet with Mr. Assorti and iron some of this out to kind of save everybody some time, but different things that didn't work out, so that's fine. So we're here, and we'll try to answer as best we can.
Does any other member of the committee want to say what they did in researching?
Well-
Sure.
Just to reiterate what Mr. Jelly is.
Please
sorry.
indicate your name.
Yes, my apologies. Tom Sokol. I wanted to reiterate in response to your question directly, Mrs. Goodhue, about the research piece in particular, just to add a little bit more meat to what he said. It is true that we originally used the Macomb County Ethics Ordinance as the base, but since then, as he stated, a lot of the verbiage that we have in there does come in a significant portion from the Huron and Birmingham ordinances as well. In some cases where it made sense, we did tweak some of the verbiage in that document, but a lot of it, 90-something% of it did come from other existing ordinances. I just wanted to make sure that was clear because you had a very straight question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Does anybody else have any questions?
Not regarding that, no. So, Madam Chair, if I may, at our last meeting, there were some legalities, Tom, that you had concerns with, within the ordinance. And I believe you specifically addressed majority of them with the committee. Has anything been resolved with the issues that you had, with legal language at the previous workshop? Has anything been changed since then?
Well, I haven't, since I didn't get this, and I know Karen was sick yesterday, so I didn't see the draft until this morning. So the draft that we got this week is substantially different from the draft that we previously had. Is that fair?
I wouldn't say you're talking about what I have for add-ons was, where's my sheet here?
Oh, maybe I'm wrong, but
Yeah, not substantial, Tom. On the actual ordinance, page 13, we added item 1G, and that was the handout that you should have up there now. And I believe Ms. Goodhue ran the clean copy I sent her Monday. But at any rate, and then I think page 6 on the bylaws, the wording subcommittee, we took out. Other than that, I wouldn't say there was substantial changes in it.
all right. Well, I haven't gone through it in great detail.
Okay.
But, yeah, back in October, I sent the committee through Mr. Gelios a long list of concerns that I had. He and I talked on the phone, and I think I explained some of those verbally to him. I don't know if that made any changes or not. And then I provided to the committee, and I think I copied the board on that, about a page and a half, confidential memorandum. It's confidential because it's an attorney opinion about draft language of an ordinance that addresses specifically whether or not the complaints that would be issued under the ordinance would be subject to FOIA or not. And I provided that to him, and we've got several other things. There's still, if he's telling me there aren't substantial changes, none of my other concerns have really been, I guess, haven't been addressed. There's some, substantial issues with some of these determinations.
Okay. Go ahead and respond. When we had our committee meeting, April 3rd, our last committee meeting, we discussed the confidentiality item, and the committee ultimately agreed that in the long run, it would be better if it was more open. We were getting at that discussion about as it applies to FOIA. But my concerns were, when we talked in November, was the different, well, I still go back to the FOIA laws. For instance, under public disclosure, public records exempt from disclosure, there's a thing in here about constitutes an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. Maybe you can explain what that really means. Does a person have a right to privacy? I had maintained originally, but I'm abiding by the committee's decision. We talked about at length the 3rd, but to my way of thinking, I did FOIAs for 14 years here. Until if an employee or a board member comes to the ethics board and says, hey, let me run this by you and let me know if this is a violation or not, okay? And they lay out whatever the scenario is. Well, if the ethics board says, no, that's not a violation, you're all set, does that constitute a public record? I don't think so, in my own personal opinion, until it's finalized or formalized, and if the ethics board says, yeah, okay, this is a complaint, you want to go forward, and then it's filed, with the clerk and then the rest of the board, then yeah, that becomes a public record. But somebody asking for an advisory opinion, me personally, I'll argue with it, but on the other hand, too, it was brought up at the committee meeting that if a Board of Trustee member comes and asks for an opinion, and we tell them no, and there's nothing documented, and then they do whatever it is, maybe that was in question, and somebody else then makes a complaint about that, well, then that board member could say, well, wait a minute, I went to the Board of Ethics, and they told me that this wasn't a violation. You know what I mean? So we just decided overall, leave it open. But like I said, I'm seeing in several things, you know, the FOIA, the other thing was, my argument was, a public record or information which is furnished by the public body originally compiling, preparing, or receiving a record or information to a public officer or public body in connection with the performance of the duties. That's an exemption if the consideration originally given rise to the exempt nature of the public record becomes applicable. To me, it would, you know, become applicable. The county ordinance has all complaints under meetings and materials, all complaints, all responses to complaints, and all other records of the ethic board except legal opinions or information required, you know, by state law to remain confidential. So I guess it's referring to FOIA, would be records available for public inspection once it becomes a public record. But is it a public record for somebody to seek advice? Chicago ordinance, it clearly says the identity of the person requesting the opinion and of any person whose conduct is involved in a set of circumstances described in a request for an opinion shall be confidential. So I guess I'm asking you, just for clarification, under the FOIA, what public record exempt from disclosure, what constitutes an invasion of personal privacy? I mean, on the one hand, I could argue it's not fair. Let's say if Ms. Nevers came and asked for an opinion from the ethics board, is that a public record for us? Not us, but I mean the real ethics board to give her an opinion? That to me, that doesn't rise to a public record. And I think Roger pointed out another time, even when the hearings, if it goes all the way to a hearing, a person can request a closed session, just like an employee does now. If it's something to do with a termination or whatever, they can request to have a closed session. Well, closed sessions aren't subject to FOIA either. So I'm just confused what constitutes confidentiality, I guess. The other thing under FOIA was communications and notes between and within public bodies of an advisory nature to the extent that they cover other than purely factual materials, an opinion, and are preliminary to a final agency determination, ethics board. This exemption does not apply unless the public body shows that in a particular instance in public interest in encouraging frank communication between officials and employees of public bodies clearly outweighs the public interest. Well, to me, there's got to be some confidentiality, certainly on the part of an employee. If they come to the ethics board, they say, hey, I seen this or that, and I don't think it's right. What do you think? And we give them an advisory opinion. That to me, that doesn't rise to a public record until it's filed, until the ethics board says, yes, that's a legit complaint, and do you want to proceed? Yes, then it's a public record. But just to seek an advisory opinion, in my mind, I don't agree. But like I said, as a committee, we weighed it all out and said, okay, it probably would be more beneficial than not for all concerned, but I don't know. I'm just confused on what that whole thing means, and that's what we discussed the first time around, that whole thing about confidential. What is confidentiality? And the right to evasion of privacy. Is it fair to use Ms. Nevers' example? Somebody comes and says something, they seen her do or not do. Is it fair to her that if the ethics board says, no, there's nothing to this, that's not a violation, why should her name be up in the first place?
So if a police officer pulls somebody over, takes them into custody, takes them in, the notes and everything, would that be subject to FOIA? You did that for a long
Yeah,
time.
police report.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what if they find him not responsible and they let him go? They take him in, take him under custody.
Well, if they take him in custody, that the whole process becomes a public record. Let me
Okay,
ask you
all right.
this.
So-
If somebody stops me on the road and says, "Officer, can I cut through a gas station to avoid a red light? Is that a crime?" And I say, "Yes, it is." You know, to avoid a red light, you cut a corner, you go through private property to get on the other street. That's disobey? Civil infraction. But them asking the officer that question, is that a public record? Is there a report on that? No.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
If it's in writing, I disagree with you.
No, it's not right. I'm saying, I'm driving along,
If it's not in writing, there's no document to produce under FOIA.
okay. So you're saying the ethics board can't give an advisory opinion without going through the whole process of the civil infraction?
No, what we talked about was complaints filed under the ordinance that you had drafted, whether or not those were subject to FOIA.
Once they're filed, I agree. But not an advisory opinion. To me, there's a difference between an advisory opinion and a complaint being filed. That's all I'm saying.
Can I ask a question? How would a person, so somebody wants an advisory opinion of the board, how do they get that board together to go and ask them advice?
Well, I believe the county meets every month anyway. So when they meet, they would talk it over and say, okay, they could say, okay, we're gonna give this person an opinion. But they don't necessarily, what I'm saying, they don't have to file it as a complaint filed by that person. They're asking for advice. That's what the ethics board's, supposed to guide people to doing the right thing. If an employee has a question, I'm saying employee, it could be a board member also. They have a question and the answer is provided, especially in the pretense before it occurs. Nothing's occurred. They're just simply asking, hey, I got invited to a dinner with a contractor or whatever, and this and that. Is that a violation? Well, if the ethics board gives them their interpretation of the ordinance on that, is that some public record that the public's entitled to see? Not until it's filed as a complaint, to my mind.
But does the board, are they like everybody else where they have to take minutes and?
Yeah.
So
There's-
because if we have a resident that comes up here and asks us a question, advice, it's in the minutes, so
Yes.
just trying to.
Well, I've seen in other places too, they'll assign a number. They'll say, the county, they do use a name though too, but they use a complaint number such and such regarding, they don't go, I was looking at their minutes today, they don't go into big detail about what the item was unless it was a complaint. They'll talk about it in general and then they'll say, so-and-so was advised that it did not constitute a violation of the ethics ordinance, so the thing was dismissed. That's it. So, there's no report. I mean, the ethics board wouldn't report to the board, hey, we had an inquiry and we answered it, and or an inquiry about if something was ethical or unethical, and we deemed it wasn't unethical, and that was the decision we gave them. I mean, the ethics board has to report to the board, I guess presumably once a month or whatever the board would say, and they make that, they'll say, well, we received 3-4 complaints, whatever, and they were about this or that. But if they don't file it as a complaint, it looks to me like the county ethics board can say they can dismiss it. It doesn't go any further. I mean, I don't agree that every time somebody asks for an advisory opinion, it automatically is something that can be released out there. I mean, even the FOIA law says there's something about invasion of privacy. That's all. I'm just confused about that. What does that mean? I mean,
Madam Chair.
without your due process, what is that?
Mr. Sokol, you had something to add?
Tom Sokol, I just wanted to comment on this question here. The whole entire committee was very sensitive to the fact that this could be abused, okay? And obviously there could be people out there that could use this in a manner to try to embarrass people and just make up frivolous things just to throw it out there, just in an attempt to make people look bad, especially at certain times of the year or the term. Like, we're all very sensitive to that. We asked that question to the county, and it was articulated to us that the overwhelming majority of all claims that are made don't make it to the point where there's an investigation and they're making a ruling. Most of the claims that are made or complaints that are made are stopped very early. That being said, it might make sense to have to treat differently an opinion versus a complaint. But that being said, there still needs to be documentation. And I think, and again, it was something we're confused about. We're not passionate either way. We'd be looking for advice in terms of what should be protected and what shouldn't. That's not something that any of us are adamant that we think this whole process is going to be broken if something's not public or versus confidential. However, if there's advice that they need recommendations on, take the example from earlier, if one of the board members wanted an opinion if something was appropriate for their own protection, if the ethics board is saying this is okay to do, they need to have that documented, right? It can't just be, yeah, that's okay, and then they go do it, then later on, they end up in trouble, right? So there should be some documentation there. But I think we're open to whatever makes sense to working with the board and working with Mr. Assorti, that if there are certain things that are sensitive that have to be confidential, then we're open to that. But in general, I think it needs to be transparency, and I think the majority of these either opinions and or complaints need to be something that can be FOIA'd. If there's some exceptions, then we should talk about it. So hopefully that gives a little bit more clarification. I was trying to be concise, so thank you for allowing me to speak on that.
May I add something, please? Rob Montia. Just wanted to share that, to back up a step to Ms. Goodhue's question, and Mr. Sokol hinted at this, touched on it. Part of our research also was to bring in Dr. Don Amboyer, who is the chairperson of the current Macomb County Ethics Board. He sat in one of our meetings and spent a good 2 hours very graciously helping us understand their current ethics policy, some of the challenges they've had. We had a lot of questions for him that he answered, and he's been available for questions since then as well for a variety of things that have come up. So a lot of our determinations on some of the things in the current policy that we have were coming straight from the county policy. Now, relevant to the county policy, which we were thinking about all along as well on this particular topic of is something FOIAble or not, and there is one particular piece in the current county ethics policy, if I could read it. All complaints, all responses to complaints, and all other records of the ethics board, except legal opinions or information required by state or federal law to remain confidential, shall be records available for public inspection and copying. So if it's open, it could be open. Again, as Mr. Sokol was saying, we could go either way. We were trying to be sensitive that information was coming in for the right reasons and that sort of thing. So if legally we have to keep it open, we keep it open. I don't think that there's any concern from this committee that we do it one way or the other. We just want to make sure the right thing is done. So if there is a particular legal direction that should go, just let's confirm what that is.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Madam Chair, if I may, Mr. Gelios, I think it would be helpful, and or Mr. Montia, if you've worked with Dr. Ambrura, what was the, I think what we're getting hung up here is more on procedure versus policy or ordinance. So I think the concern is that if such an ordinance was to be adopted, then it becomes, the board takes over the authority of that or appoints a board to this ordinance to follow through with it. A procedure needs to be put in place as to, okay, Mr. Gelios, you had suggested that possibly somebody could verbally address the ethics board and ask even if what they have a concern with have merit.
Yes.
So in that sense, is it by telephone? Do they call a particular board member to verbally have this conversation? Because you mentioned they may meet once a month, but if somebody wants it to be confidential and not be known as the person that could be potentially putting in this ethics complaint, they wouldn't necessarily want to come to a monthly meeting to ask the question, because they would be, it
Right.
would keep them from being
Well,
private.
most of these communities have something, in today's age, they have an online part of their website set up for that where somebody can make a complaint. It could be specified, we at least need your name. If that person wants to say, well, I'd like to remain confidential, but yeah, they could receive it by the internet, the website, today's age, how you gonna
Do you know if that's what the county does?
I don't know, honestly. I don't know. Mr. Amboy was unavailable tonight, but they,
You can email it in.
huh?
You can email it.
Yeah, you can email it in.
It's gotta be notarized, though.
Oh, gotta be notarized? Okay. Yeah, so I guess it gotta be notarized. But the county, like I said, I was looking at their minutes just today, as a matter of fact, and they're in the process of revamping their ordinance. They were supposed to have a meeting, I believe yesterday, and it was canceled, so they got another one in May coming up. So they're addressing it, and some of the concerns we're hearing now. They're looking at the fines. I think, Ms. Good, you brought that up last time. Well, how do we make people pay? And some ordinances I've seen, the finance department currently sends unpaid penalties to a collection agency. That's from the county ethics too, but the meeting. But they have, they're looking at, let me see if I can find exactly. I believe they're addressing a confidentiality issue. Where the heck was it? Well, see, now from their minutes, this is from the County Ethics Board, December 18th, 2018. I was just trying to wrap my head around how they do it. It says, a complaint was received from, and they mention him as a public record, from a Mr. Joseph Elias, and the information was returned to him. It did not pertain to the ethics ordinance. That's it. So it doesn't go in a great detail about what it was he asked about, or asked.
That's in their minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's verbatim. A complaint was received from a Mr. Joseph Elias, and the information was returned to him. It did not pertain to the ethics ordinance.
Okay.
And that's what I'm saying. Does that that's not a public other than being in the minutes, yes. Does somebody ask a question, that's fine.
But it doesn't indicate how he submitted the complaint, correct?
No.
So if it was a complaint submitted in writing, it would be a document that could potentially be FOIAble. If he had his complaint verbally, then obviously that would not be something that's subject to FOIA. So that's the difference there, is, I guess, in a matter of how the person actually submits the complaint.
Yeah.
But if it's in the form of a document and the township receives it, it is FOIAble.
An email is then, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, which is fine.
Yeah.
So you are correct in saying that if somebody verbally contacted a board member and asked for advice, is that FOIAble? No, it's not. Obviously, it's just a conversation had.
Right.
But if they complete the complaint in writing and submit it, then it is.
Yeah.
And then the response in return is FOIAble. I think the concern would be is if the complaint that's submitted has no merit to it and it's just somebody's effort to grandstand and get a headline in a newspaper.
Right.
That becomes FOIAble. And
Right.
chances are that same person is not going to post or publicize that it was denied by the ethics board for not having any merit.
Right.
Right.
And if I may, this is from the same minutes, December 2018. Chair Amboy discussed the possibility that there may be another version of the ethics ordinance proposed at the 10 a.m. meeting today. This was the one that was canceled. He said the board's currently in a revision process and reviewed the evolution of the ordinance. I guess it goes back to 2010. I didn't realize it went back that far. He reported he had gone through the 2010 version of the ordinance, the charter document, the 2016 version of the ordinance, meeting notes from 2017. Prepared for the meeting. This is some of the concerns they're going to be discussing, though, related to the prior and current version of the ordinance, additional definitions they felt could be added, some questions regarding the applicability of the ordinance to volunteers, and they talked about confidentiality in relation to transparency. They also discussed the investigations and who should be responsible and to what degree. They didn't discuss the fine, how to go about getting payment from a violator, other than what I read in the one, or the, having the county or the treasurer turn it over to collection agency. But anyway, so that's just a little insight. So they're working on it too, which just proves that this thing is it's not etched in stone. It's a living document. It can be addressed and readdressed as the need arises and different things come up. So, I mean, we're just trying to get something intact that would kind of help,
Madam Chair?
Oh,
When you were speaking with Mr. Amboyer, did he happen to mention how many violations or whatever or complaints that were filed?
he said that annually they average about 4 to 5
And has this
and
A month?
That are real,
a month?
a year.
that are real complaints.
They're real complaints, and the rest are not.
Did he give
not-
you a number on how many were not, that are,
No.
yeah?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't, yeah. But he said they dealt with about 4, they deal with actual complaints about 4 or 5 a year for the whole year.
And does he feel that the ordinance has helped having that in place?
Yeah, I think some of the things he expressed to us when we met with him on the second meeting was he felt, and that may come about in the revision, I don't know, but he felt that the ethics board should be the determining body to at least determine what is a legit complaint and what isn't. In other words, there's no reason to advance something just because somebody's politically grandstanding or whatever. I think Ms. Nevers brought up last time, that's a concern. If somebody comes in, I seen somebody doing this or that and the other, and the board looks at it and says, well, this isn't a violation. Why should it go any further? That's what I'm saying, And then, but if they do say, okay, yeah, there's something to this, then that person has to do their complaint, has to be notarized and all that, and then they'll roll with it. And then if they would give it, I presume, to the clerk to get a number assigned to it or whatever. She lets the board know, and then the board decides whether they want to have the attorney write it or not. Some of the other ordinances, and Mr. Assorti said he was very familiar with the municipal civil infraction ordinances, particularly I think we discussed Bruce Township, is you can word it a lot of ways. The current code enforcement officer can be your bureau. They refer to it as a bureau, but he or she can be the person who writes the appearance ticket at the direction of the board for an informal hearing. Now, then if it goes in, if it goes in front of a magistrate, and then that, basically like a civil infraction, responsible, not responsible, responsible with explanation, and then if the person says, no, hell no, I want a formal hearing, then yeah, I guess the attorney has to get involved. But that's gonna be very rare. I mean, I don't know.
I did find our notes from the meeting with Dr. Amboyer, and he indicated they received about 10 to 12 advisory requests per year and 4 to 5 complaints per year.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, if I can ask. I'm sorry, with the county, I just want to make sure on procedure on this. So do they contact the ethics board through a meeting? They have a meeting once a month and they come and present their issues at that point? Or can they write the letter and submit it?
The process is that there is a form. There's both an
Right.
advisory form separate from a complaint form, and you put that in writing, and you can either mail it in or email it in.
And it has to be notarized, correct?
It has to be notarized.
Okay.
Correct.
And now we're talking that we might want to have an email that they can email the board?
Well, it seems like most of the communities that have an ethics ordinance have a provision in there, just like we have our own website now, the township. It could just be something that's added onto either the front end or whatever, or somebody would click to it, and the form would be there, and they could print it at home and fill it out and get it notarized.
And the township would provide?
Yeah,
Okay.
the notarization just sort of, I think, ensures,
No, I agree. It should be notarized.
To be authentic.
Right, it should be notarized.
well, I in my previous life, if somebody wanted to make a complaint against an officer, okay, and they call in and they're hot and they're whatever, they got a ticket and they didn't like it and all that. Well, they call and that officer was an SOB, he did this or that. What did our command officers say? Come on in, put it in writing. Almost always, they never did. Right? Because they, oh, wait a minute, I got to put my name to it. So that's the only reason we felt adding that notary thing. Okay, you want to make a complaint, let's make it official. And I think that would eliminate a lot of false complaints. And then we added, like I said earlier, to the regular ordinance, excuse me, under B, functions of the Board of Ethics, we added the wording G, you can see, and it just says, any person who files a complaint alleging a violation of this ordinance, knowing that that material information provided therein is not true, or that information provided therein was made in reckless disregard for the truth, may be subject to a fine. In other words, it's a violation in itself. May be subject to a fine up to $500, as well as any reasonable costs incurred by the township in investigating the complaint and the reasonable costs. And then when I ran that by Mr. Amboyer, he said, and in addition, that person's liable for civil, civilly. That the person who the complaint falsely was made against that person can then take that person to court civilly. People aren't going to do that.
And who's going to investigate that? The sheriff's department?
No, the ethics board is the investigating body initially for any and all complaints.
To find out if
But
it's
if
true or not.
if the ethics board, somebody comes in and make a complaint and it's obviously not a violation and obviously looks like, BS, then they'd say, hey, that's it. And then then the person who's the subject of that would be advised, because that's in the procedure too, you advise who the complaint was made. Because that was the other thing Mr. Amboyer said too, was he says, I want everything open because I want to know. If somebody comes in and makes a complaint against me, I want to know right away. I don't want anybody trying to protect me or whatever. I want to be aware of it, because if I know I'm not, if he says, if I'm guilty, so be it. But if I'm not guilty, he says, there'll be hell to pay. I'll take that person to court for, making a false complaint against me and this and that. So, that's kind of how that went. But the ethics board is the initial contact, I guess, for any and all complaints or inquiries, either from a board member or employee or whatever.
So then, under the language you're proposing, if somebody's charged a $500 fine, are they subject to the hearing process as well?
Yeah, I suppose if they're issued a municipal civil infraction and they don't plead guilty to it and they demand a hearing, then the ethics board would have a hearing and it would go to the magistrate in the court.
Yes.
Madam-
Yeah.
The county's different than we are, so you have to explain to me, who does the ethics board over there report to?
The Board of Commissioners.
Board of Commissioners?
Mhm.
Okay.
And, Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
Following Karen's question, so their board who would have the last say? In other words, the Board of Ethics would ferret through this and say it's a valid complaint or not valid.
Right.
A valid complaint. If it were a valid complaint, then it goes to the Board of Commissioners, and they in turn.
They notify their legal counsel,
Okay.
and he runs with it.
Okay.
If it goes to a hearing, formal hearing.
So the final decision would lie with that board?
Yes.
Okay.
See, the board could, what we're seeing too in other things is the board, once they get the complaint, the ethics board says, okay, this is a legit complaint, and the board of trustees is made aware of it. They don't necessarily have to, it doesn't necessarily have to end up in court. It could be dealt with, if it's an employee, as disciplinary, if it's a public official, a censure. It's not etched in stone that they have to, take them to court.
But I guess what I'm trying to get at is who has See, because my opinion is, we as elected board officials have a fiduciary responsibility to vote on all things.
Right.
Whether it's a difficult vote or an easy vote. And if this board didn't have the last say, I would feel I would be abdicating my fiduciary responsibility.
No, the board
Okay.
is, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not in question. The board would then direct, if they want to proceed in court, then they would have to tell Mr. Asori, direct him to follow up with a municipal civil infraction. But the board could deal with a violation in many ways. Now, if the board passes it, you'll have to come up with a simple ordinance that defines the fines. You know, some communities they'll start at $50, and a second offense within 3 years is a $100 fine. So the board would have to do that. That's not difficult.
Mr. Sordy, you had a comment?
Well, I wanted to, so back to if somebody files a false
Claim.
claim.
Claim, yeah.
So who determines it says up to the $500. Who makes that determination? The Board of Trustees?
Yes.
Okay. And then it also says, as well as reasonable costs incurred. How would that happen? Like, how do we
Probably when the attorney gets involved, and he's going to have his bills for,
the township attorney?
yeah,
Okay.
then he could tack that on to going, ask the court to make a judgment for that, too.
So, Mr. Sordi, if I may, you shook your head at that point. Could you explain why?
Don't you have to identify that as municipal civil infraction for it to be enforced?
Yeah, you'd have to have a municipal civil infraction ordinance, which, you said you had plenty of experience with. It's pretty easy. Bruce Township has one, and they designate a bureau, I believe.
Yeah, but bureaus don't make determinations of responsibility or not responsibility by statute. All they can do is accept responsibility and establish, and the only thing they can do other than accept the responsibility and the payment
Right.
is to adjust, for instance, the fines.
That's-
It's not uncommon to have a bureau to come in and say, when you admit responsibility with an explanation, to come in and say, I need, somebody in my family died or whatever, and they say, okay, they can cut the fine in half, but they can't make a determination
No.
of responsibility or non-responsibility. So
I agree. That's still the board. The board would direct whoever they deem to be the municipal, whether it's you or the code enforcement officer, building official, whoever. It could be anything.
Well, that
Anybody.
leads to my next question then. So if there's a violation and you said an informal hearing, who would represent the township at the informal hearing? Because I can't, nor can
Nope,
an attorney.
in front of a magistrate, there's no attorney. They're not allowed to bring an attorney on an informal hearing in front of a magistrate.
So it would just be the magistrate and the person alleged to have violated the municipal civil
Well,
infraction?
probably then whoever wrote the ticket would probably have to be there. Just like a traffic ticket, the officer has to be there.
That's my point. So if you have the attorney write the ticket and the attorney has to be there, then there cannot be any informal hearing.
Well, you can have a code enforcement officer be, just like he would write a ticket for anything else, be it blight or barking dog or whatever. Why can't he be designated by the board to write a municipal civil infraction? And then as part of his duties, if it comes up on the day of court, he goes to court on it. So what?
So we'd have our code enforcement officer enforcing a ethics ordinance in the court?
At the direction of the board. Once the ethics board tells the board of trustees, this was a violation, here's a complaint we got, it's valid, and this and that. It's up to the board to determine what to do with it.
I'm talking about the procedural aspect of appearing in court
Yeah.
for the,
Well, if the board of trustees designates the code enforcement officer, for instance, writes the appearance ticket, then just like any other appearance ticket he writes, doesn't he have to go to court when that comes up?
sure, if you get too much junk in your backyard or anything
Right.
else. Right.
Barking dog, whatever.
But you don't go to those.
Correct. Yeah,
No.
right, we can't.
Right.
So basically, to sum it up, that if an infraction was written against
Me.
Tom Sokol, I didn't want to pick
Tom's
anybody
dog.
out.
Volunteer.
Sorry. So if an infraction was written against Tom Assorti, and the Board of Trustees determines that he should be fined $100 for what he did. It could end there.
Yeah.
Okay. Then he says, no, I don't feel that I should be fined the $100. I want to go to court. Mr. Assorti, not legal Mr. Assorti, then has to go to court and represent himself against who?
You said the code enforcement officer.
Well, whoever issued the
What if
ticket.
so what if it's somebody in the building, right? So my question is, what if it's an employee, a department head, or a board member? So the code enforcement person that works for the township has to be the plaintiff and,
Well, that's up for that would be up for the Board of Trustees to say. They could say, well, we'll use the current code enforcement officer. They could use a building official. They should designate anybody, the treasurer.
right, but my
We've
point
seen.
is, so we would be putting somebody who works for the township in court against somebody who potentially works for the township.
Or their boss.
That's where I was going with all of
That,
this.
so that's what I'm just concerned
Right.
with.
Sure, sure.
I just wanted to be transparent about the fact that the overwhelming majority of the time that we spent in this committee was coming up with the ordinance draft in terms of what the content should be in the actual ordinance, okay? We spent minimal time on developing a process map and a decision-making tree with if-then statements of what all these handoffs and touch points that we've been spending the last several minutes on. And so a lot of this, what you were hearing, is Mr. Gellius's experience in law enforcement. But the reality is, as a committee, we didn't spend the majority of our time discussing all these touch points. We focused on developing the content and what we wanted to see in the ordinance. Obviously, the application of it in the real world is really important. And these are one of the reasons why we discussed and requested if we could work with Mr. Assorti in a working meeting to come up with the details around these things, because we want to make sure that it's logical and it makes sense and it's executable, right? And so I just want to make sure that I'm very clear. The bulk of the time we spent was on the content and not on these touch points. So hopefully that helps. Well, we look forward to developing some type of process map and decision tree. We're open to that. Okay, but we don't have any strong recommendations in terms of how this has to be in regards to this last line of questioning. Does that make sense?
Madam Chair, if I may. So, but there seems to, so I'm taking it as there's a sense of urgency to adopt the ethics ordinance. And it's, there's been insinuations that those that are not in favor or questionable on it is unethical because they haven't rushed to adopt this. So my question to Mr. Assorti is, if we were to adopt this ordinance, it becomes a part of the township, which the Board of Trustees is responsible for. So if we adopt this ordinance but have no idea how to proceed with what happens when we receive a complaint and/or how to handle enforcement, do we have to have the procedures and the ordinance at the same time? Or can we have an ordinance but not be expected to enforce it because we don't have a procedure yet? I'm just lining it up. Can we have an ordinance without procedures? How do we enforce if we adopt it without knowing how to enforce it?
That's a good point.
I mean, you can make all the laws you want. If you don't have a means to enforce it, what good are they? That was the point that I was getting to. Not that I'm in favor of it or not in favor, which certainly doesn't matter for me. My job's to help you make sure that you have something that works. And that was my concern. That's been my concern with the ethics ordinance draft that it is and the hearing process. I don't know how you transfer that hearing process to an ethics board, not under the revised Judiciary Act. That's what I'm trying to.
So could I ask a question on that, Mr. Assorti? So scrap what we have and what we've talked about, right? Because let's just say we've got to come up with some sort of enforcement mechanism,
Right.
generically titled, right? We got to figure it out. In your legal opinion, is it enforceable when we find that there's an ethics violation and we want to fine somebody? Is that enforceable at a township level? And could we possibly craft an enforcement process for that?
Again, I I have a hard time, and what I'm struggling with, is the board set up to make a determination whether or not there's a violation or not?
Well, forget the, hold on a second, guys. Forget the layering, because I think that's part of the process. Just let's say whether it is the ethics board or the township board or combination thereof, in the context of fielding a complaint, they realize that there is a violation of ethics, and a fine would be levied somehow by whichever entity has determination to do so. Can there be a path to enforce that?
Well, so I got to have some answers first. So is a violation of the ethics ordinance a municipal civil infraction?
You'd have to make it by ordinance. You'd have to
Okay.
designate it as a municipal civil
So
infraction.
your intent is yes, to have it be
Yes.
a municipal civil infraction? Okay.
If it's a violation. So is the board making a determination of whether or not it's a municipal civil infraction or not?
If you make it an ordinance, if you make a municipal, just like Bruce Township did, if you make that a municipal civil infraction, then that would be a municipal civil infraction.
Does Bruce Township have a board making a determination whether or not the violations in fact have
So let me back up, because I think we're conflating the details and the weeds here, and I understand we got to get to that, but I'm still struggling with conceptually, can this even be possible? Because no, hold on. The question is, whichever entity, whether it's the Board of Trustees or an ethics board, a permanent ethics board, can they find whoever, we can determine who is the appropriate entity to make the determination, right? So let's assume that we go through the process and figure that out. And somebody files a complaint and they're in violation. Can that be enforceable? And is it through the municipal civic, what was it, municipal civil? Or if that's not viable, is there another means? And if not, then it's not enforceable regardless? I'm just trying to understand, is there a path to enforcement that we have to do the work to figure out the correct process or not?
Absolutely there is. But
Okay, so-
in your draft, is the board, that you go through this whole hearing process, does anybody else have a hearing process like that?
To our point, because we're trying to understand the legalese of this and the legalities, this was our first stab
Okay.
with not one single lawyer on this committee. So the question that we're raising is whether you're providing advice to us on how to do this. We want to come up with the correct process. Can we do so? And it doesn't have to happen necessarily in this session. We just know that this is a gap. We have to fix it.
Can you come up with a process to enforce a municipal civil infraction?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we can come up with that in collaboration, I would assume, with yourself and the board, which is what we've been talking about. And you can provide the legal advice and the boundaries by which we can't cross in order to make this effectively happen. We can talk about the appropriate entity, whether it be the township board or the ethics board, that would determine if somebody was in violation and levy a fine, and make sure that we come up with a process that has all the legal ticks and ties, and we can put forward before this board to have a comprehensive review and hopefully an approval. Other than that, I think we're going back and forth on discussion points that we just simply haven't had the opportunity to vet out.
Okay.
Madam Chair, if I may. So, Mr. Assorti, right now, we have all types of ordinances in place. Say it's, what is it, dog barking, right? There's an ordinance for that. So, can you walk us through the process?
Sure. So we have municipal civil infractions, okay? You piled up trash in your backyard, you're not cutting your grass, okay? We have an ordinance officer that enforces those by writing either a municipal civil infraction notice, in which case the person could admit responsibility, deny responsibility, come in and pay it to the treasurer. I don't think we're doing any of those, but we have the means to do that.
Come pay
Pay the township treasurer.
for, if it's a notice.
If it's a notice. If not, the code enforcement officer, which is what happens 99.9% of the time, writes a ticket, which becomes a civil infraction, which goes to the court, and then the court makes a determination of whether or not there has been a violation of the ordinance.
So it goes from municipal code infraction to civil infraction. Am I
Right, so so a municipal civil infraction can be a civil infraction, a civil infraction can't be, does that make sense?
Yep, okay. So, and once it goes to civil infraction, the township goes to court.
Correct, once a ticket is issued for a civil infraction, it goes to court.
The person has the option to pay it or go to court,
No, he's gotta go.
but they have to go to court once
No,
the ticket's issued.
you can go to court, just like it, so at that point, it's the same as a traffic ticket,
Okay,
all right? You know, a speeding ticket, all right? So you can pay the ticket, you can go for a hearing. You can go to an informal hearing or a formal hearing. If it's an informal hearing, the township's not represented by council, nor is the individual.
okay.
So we'd have to find somebody in the, but they could go through a whole hearing. They would have to explain to the judge what was violated, how it was violated, you know, right? So we have people that are trained to say, Your Honor, our ordinance says that you can't have more than 6 trash cans. On this day, here's pictures. They had 3 more. So we'd have to have somebody that's skilled in understanding how you would make that argument in front of a court if you're not going to have an attorney represent you.
So if, just like any other ordinance, if we were to adopt this ordinance, we could possibly follow how we enforce other ordinances in the same manner?
Absolutely.
Okay.
What would be more appropriate would be to say, the following things, we, you know, the township hereby creates a municipal civil infraction ordinance regarding ethics. The following things are ethics violations which constitute a municipal civil infraction. In which case, then, we would use the Judiciary Act to enforce that process. But the implementation of a board to make a determination whether or not a person's responsible for a violation of the ordinance is the job that the state legislature has put upon, some time ago, put upon our judiciary through the revised Judiciary Act, if that makes sense.
No. Did it make sense to anybody else? I mean, I'm not
I'm
criticizing,
lost.
I got lost though.
So imagine that if we, the way that it's currently set up with some of the stuff, if we have this panel, so if I'm driving down the road and I'm going 5 miles an hour over the speed limit, I receive a ticket. The way this ordinance is drafted, I go in front of the board, and then the board makes a determination whether or not it was going in violation, exceeding the ticket, or exceeding the speed or not. Right, isn't that what?
No, that's
No?
not what we said. The board determines whether the complaint is valid or not, then the board gets the information, the board trustees. They're the ones who then determine what, if any, further action is required, whether it's discipline or appearance tickets issued. If they determine, yes, it's a violation, it's a municipal civil infraction violation, then the board would direct whoever the designee is, whether it's you or the code enforcement, to write the ticket.
You know, if
I don't understand what the hearing process is for then.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
No.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
We can, but they can't on the,
First one that said I.
you gotta, they're recording it, they need the,
I'm Steve Ferrari. I don't think that's what we're talking about at all. Dogs barking and things like that. I spent 27 years in the federal government and another 13 with the state government. And we had ethics. All right? Some might say, yeah, we don't have that much good ethics anymore, but, you know. We had set guidelines. You can do this, and if you do that, you're in trouble. What that means is you get a couple of weeks on the beach. Some employee that does something wrong, like driving his car or taking a car and using it for something he's not supposed to have, or possibly, let's say, stealing something from. Now, do we write a ticket to the guy? Our determination would be basically to say, fire him, and then, am I right? And then, you want to prosecute him? Send it on to to send some kind of a complaint or something to the county and let them do that. That's already in the law, right? I mean, when we're talking about
no, the county wouldn't do that for a local ordinance. It would be It would be through my office or whoever I hire to do the prosecutions, right?
But that's already in place. What I think, right? Is it already in place? How to,
To prosecute for violations of our local
Sure,
ordinances?
yes.
Absolutely.
so basically what we're talking about is our ethics violations on employees, the board, elected officials, you know. That was my idea what we were doing here. Am I right? So,
Yeah.
we come,
That's, excuse me for interrupting, but that's what I'm I was just about to ask something. Instead of talking about tickets and so forth, we get to the meat of a real problem with ethics.
Right.
And you stood up, and so
Yeah.
I'm in agreement with what you're saying.
let's say we have somebody that's using the car in a way that's not supposed to be. So what do we do? Somebody makes a complaint about it, comes to us, we'll make a determination, or it comes to the ethics board, right? Make a determination, it goes to you people, and then you can turn around and you want to fire them, fire them. If you don't want to fire them, or you get some reason why you can't fire them, hey, give them a couple of weeks off without pay. That in essence right there is a pretty good fine.
If I could just interrupt a minute. If somebody uses a car illegally or steals from us, there is recourse through the collective bargaining agreement that all of our employees are under. I think that would take precedent over any ethics ordinance. It's not a matter of ethics, it's a matter of stealing.
Is everybody represented by the union?
Yes. Except for the deputies and the
Deputy chief, fire chief. and
fire
myself.
chief and the deputy and Mr. Sorty and his assistant.
But back to your question is, we already have a mechanism for that, right? So if I, as a non-represented individual, violate an ethical standard, whatever that, whether it's articulated or not by ordinance, there's a mechanism to do that, to bring that to the board to make a determination whether or not I did and appropriate conduct from there. So I'm not understanding what I'm having difficult helping you guys with is you're having a board hearing where a person's entitled to representation by counsel, and you're talking about due process, and I don't understand what you're doing at the hearing. All you're gonna do is make a recommendation?
That's how they determine whether, if it's legit or not. The ethics board has their own hearing. It's got nothing to do with the board of trustees. Once they report to the board of trustees, it's up to them to determine what to do with it.
But what determination is the ethics board making?
They're going by the ordinance. They have to follow the ordinance.
So they're making a determination whether or not the individual violated the ordinance or not?
That's why it's called an ethics board, yes.
Okay, all right. Now we're getting somewhere. So whether or not, and you said that we were gonna make that a municipal civil infraction, a violation of
That's
that
what you
ordinance.
told me it had to be. I don't necessarily say it has to be that. You told me it has to be a municipal civil infraction.
I'm not aware of any law, any other law that we would have that we could impose a penalty upon an individual as a township other than through a municipal civil infraction.
Okay?
All right, so so this panel's gonna make a determination of whether or not I or whoever's charged with it have created, or, excuse me, have been,
They would get the board's the ethics board would give them their recommendation, what they're
would they
saying.
make a determination whether or not I committed a municipal civil infraction?
And then
Okay.
they give it to the board of trustees. Now, the board of trustees can
Okay, so-
agree or disagree with it, but they'll get the recommendation from the board of ethics.
Okay.
That's
So-
all I'm saying.
So the state law says that is reserved for our judiciary, making a determination
Okay.
whether or not an individual has violated municipal civil
But
infraction.
Tom, when we put this, we handed this in, we expected or figured that you would review it and put your legal stamp on it. We're not lawyers.
Jim, you and I discussed this in October, this
Yeah,
very
I know.
topic. Okay. And I haven't changed any since then.
Okay.
Well, my name is Richard Paul. I'm part of the team that put this together too. And And the way, I think it's, you guys are, or everybody's not getting it, the way I get it is, this is kind of like a filter. Think of it as a filter, people coming, and instead of all these people coming to you with these things, it goes to this board that can figure out, is this really something that we need to worry about? Or is this something that needs to go further? And you need to understand, too, that that board that you create, it's not us, that board that you create will then be there to work with you. But the point is it's your decision. You're the final decision. Nobody's taking anything away from you. If anything, we're protecting you with this thing. And that's one thing you got to really think about and read through this. Because like he said when he opened it up, this is like the Constitution. It is a living document. This isn't something that we're just going to, if you vote on it today or tomorrow, next week or next month or next year, if you decide that you want this, it doesn't mean it stops here. It means through you guys and through, if this new board that you create, okay, this isn't working, just like it did Macomb County, this isn't working, we got to figure something out. Then we restructure it. That's what it's about. It's not something that this is in stone and has to be. But most importantly, it's a protection for everybody, you especially. That's it.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I may, I'd just like to clarify something. First of all, the Constitution isn't a living document. I understand this would be, but our Constitution is not. The other thing is, it sounds to me like we need to have a couple of steps, something that, like somebody, as you said, taking a car overnight using gas that they weren't allowed to do, that weren't given permission, and that's kind of a low level over here. Then there's something that's even more egregious, like somebody using or stealing township resources of some kind, be it, of course, money, that, goes without saying, but equipment perhaps, or whatever. Now that's at a different level. That rises to a whole different level of seriousness. So maybe we would need to develop this in a step process, maybe just step one, step two, and then boom, everybody, the papers are involved and the whole 9 yards and court and whatever. Hence what happened. I think this came out of what's happened in the past, which of course is beyond serious. So, as I said before, a regular, an ethics board, we're getting kind of conflicted too with the word board. We're a board, ethics board. Okay, so the ethics board would ferret out whether something is super serious or not, and then easily make a decision, and then come to us and we would handle there. And then if there's something that rises to a whole different level, then it comes to us right away, and then legal counsel, and we all agree that this is really serious. And so the process probably should follow that, in my opinion. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I think we've heard a lot of information, and we've received the new draft of the ordinance. I think we will take that and we will review it and see where it goes from there. Okay?
Can I just say that part of my research too, I found University of Michigan Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy, 59% of all Michigan jurisdictions have some type of ethics policy or ordinance in effect. So this isn't something that could be all that difficult, that legal counsel can't figure out the procedure, come up with a procedure to your liking, and we'll enact it. But we've said before, this committee worked hard to put all this together, as well as the auxiliary forms, just to try to expedite it. We're not attorneys. I don't pretend to know all the little legalese and all that, but there can't be, if Bruce Township has something in place, I think Macomb Township can have something in place. So I think the board needs to maybe perhaps direct Mr. Assorti to meet with us at a committee meeting, and let's get this thing done. I don't want to just sit here for a year, keep coming back.
So May I?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I gave you all my concerns in October.
We
Right?
still need to have a sit-down and go over some of this stuff,
Okay.
whether you want to or not. That's what I'm saying, the board has to direct you.
I think,
But the responses I get back from the committee through Mr. Gelios were disagreed with a lot of the opinions and.
And I also asked you some questions you never responded to, Tom. How do all these other ordinances and that
None of
have that
them,
wording
none
in
of them
there?
have, none of those ordinances, unless you can show me one, and this is the same discussion we had in October, none of them have a board that make a determination whether or not an individual has violated or created a municipal civil infraction. We've had this discussion. All of these ordinances, I could draft one, go upstairs, I could be back down here in 2 or 3 hours and have an ordinance from you. It would not have a board that makes a determination of whether or not an individual, by violating the ordinance, is guilty or responsible for violating a municipal civil infraction.
So what are you saying? What the county does is illegal?
Well,
Their board
no,
makes a
we're not a
determination.
county, Jim.
But they're still an ethics board.
Okay.
So here's a question, right? Because this is not the first township in the state, I'm assuming, that is looking to adopt an ethics policy. I'm assuming some are already in place today. I think our purpose is not to recreate the wheel, it's to leverage what's already existing and working and functioning. So what is that? So we can help do some more research. It would be helpful, Mr. Sorty, if you were able to help us navigate those waters a little bit to make sure that we're on track with doing what's in the best interest of the township and what's legal again. We're doing the best we can, but I know it's out there. And again, that's why I'm talking about the conceptual nature of it. Conceptually, we can determine that there's a violation. We can somehow a fine can be instituted. Somehow there's a process to manage that fine and that penalty, right? So I think we can figure that out with specific research and discussions to come up with a more cohesive approach.
at this time, I would suggest that we take this policy, the new revised one. We will address Mr. Attorney, Mr. Assorti to review it and possibly come back. We thank you for all your help and your advisory. You are an advisory committee. I think you've done a good job of doing that.
Thank you.
So I think at this point, I think we can probably take it from there.
Okay.
And Madam Chair, if I may, first of all, I need to apologize for being late. I thought the meeting was at 7. I'm sorry. But that being said, I think we've made some inroads. You know, we can tweak. You may want to tweak. We may want to tweak the actual ordinance, and then go through and make the process of handling the issues and what the next step would be with Mr. Assorti's help on what we need to do to get, this can't be done tonight.
Oh, no, I understand
Yeah,
that.
and it may not be done this month or next, but to work through it as quickly as we can and you know, and for sure, thanking you for all the effort and work. It's been months that you worked on this, so appreciative.
Is there any way we could set a deadline? Is there any way we could set a deadline so we can at least have a target date to say, okay, we're going to set this up and the board is going to vote on it? Is there any way we could do that?
Boy, at this time, I think that would be a good idea, but I'm not sure how we could do that because we don't know the totality of what has to be nailed down. And
Well, yeah, sometime after the board has conferred with the attorney and they direct him to meet with us and iron out some of these differences, he's more familiar with the procedure for the township, the criminal procedure for the township,
Sure.
than I am. If he's not willing to do that, we're just spinning our wheels.
I don't necessarily think that, he says he can draft an ordinance for us. He's got your ideas down. I'm not sure if we need to have another meeting, or if you need to continue. We hate to waste your time, not waste your time. I think it was time well spent. I shouldn't say that. But my opinion is, you've given us a rough draft. We can ask him to go through it and review it and
Absolutely.
and then bring it back to the board for a vote. But to give a
Absolutely.
timeline, we have a lot of things going on right now in the township, and I'd hate to put pressure on somebody. Well, you know, we've given you a lot of time to come back and meet, and you know how that works with your schedules. I wouldn't want to put it, I would put it in the near future. I don't think we want to put it off that much longer either.
Okay.
Well, again, if I may, this is not something that can be done overnight.
Oh, I know.
You know, it's a huge, it's a huge thing to undertake, to make sure that all of the mechanisms are in place properly. And the actual ordinance, believe it or not, was probably a whole lot easier to come up with than the actual way to get to how we resolve civil infractions and how it gets escalated. So that's what's, to me, that's what's going to take the time.
And if you recall too, when we presented at the first meeting with regards to the bylaws, that was an optional document. In other words, the board could throw that whole thing out and say, this is the way we want the bylaws to read. That's fine. That was just kind of an auxiliary, part of the auxiliary documents that we presented to just try to expedite the thing. So if that, I believe with the procedures would be in what happens in the bylaws and that. So that's something he can draft.
Okay, so maybe we need a consensus on the next step and the time for the next step. What seems, viable? Tom, I know you're loaded. What do you think? What's your?
He doesn't want to do it.
What do you think would?
Well, that's up to the board what they want to do
Okay.
time-wise.
All right. Madam Chair, do you have any suggestions?
I haven't even seen the new document yet,
Okay.
so, I, like you, I'm not an attorney, but I want to read through it for sure.
Sure.
Talk to maybe the three of us.
Yes, the full-time. Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Oh,
Madam Chair, I would just like to say that I've been through it. I've highlighted several things, and overall, it was a very well-done document. It addressed everything, and I've compared it to the one that Clinton Township just had drafted. It's very similar to this one. It has not fallen on deaf ears as far as I'm concerned. I've been going through it, and I have a whole comment section on mine. I will be happy to turn it over so that it's just tweaking. Sometimes there's some things that could be misinterpreted, it's just language. But overall, the ordinance in the document itself is very well done, and it gives us the basis to now put a process to enforce it, which is what we need to be organized and to be able to enforce the ordinance itself. But well done by the committee, and I truly
Thank you.
appreciate the efforts and the time that you've put into it, and it's very useful and helpful to us.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
okay. We'll move on to public comments on non-agenda items. No one? Very well. Then we need a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Motion by Ms. Goodhue,
Second.
seconded by Ms. Posey to adjourn.